All right, welcome to our first lesson of zoology. So these first few lessons will cover some things that we may have talked about in botany, but just with the lens of specifically looking at it from an animal point of view. So this first lesson is going to be about properties of life. So learning goal is that you'll be able to describe what defines a living thing. So how can we scientifically distinguish something is living versus something is not living? All right, so this is our first lesson in zoology, so let's look at what a zoologist might do. So zoologists are going to be people who study animals, so a lot of that might be out in the field. So this is a zoologist studying the behavior of yellow baboons in Kenya. So it's really cool, a lot of field work, some lab work as well. So zoology is the scientific study of animal life, just like botany was the scientific study of plants, and it utilizes technologies and methods from all branches of science. And it seeks to document and systematically organize the diversity of animal life. We want to understand how animals function, we want to understand how animals evolved, and we want to be able to organize every single individual species into its kind of evolutionary tree and see who's related to what and how things came to be. So just like that first slide, we saw someone working out in the field. Zoology can also be in a lab because we have little microorganisms that are considered to be within the animal kingdom. It could be out in the field. It's very, very diverse. So principles of modern zoology. There's two important theories that guide zoological research. The first is the theory of evolution, and then the second is the chromosomal theory of inheritance. We will talk about both of these later in this chapter. So let's talk about the fundamental properties of life. So first we have the historical continuity of life. So what is life? There's really no simple definition. You'll see in a couple slides we have, I think, 8 bullet points that have to exist in some way for something to be living, but it's not one simple definition. And the history of life shows extensive and ongoing change called evolution. The world has changed, mutations arise that make one individual slightly different from the original species, and maybe that's really beneficial, and then they might turn into their whole own species if it works well and they live and reproduce. The answer must be based on the common history of life on Earth. So we can't just look at what exists now. We need to look at everything that has existed and how things have come to be. So this common history can be traced backward through time from the diverse forms observed today and in the fossil record to their common ancestor that arose almost 4 billion years ago. So this fossil right here is a really famous fossil. I'm not going to try to say the name because it is fairly complicated, but this is what's considered like the first walking fish. So all animal life and plant life originated in the oceans. So this is one of the first creatures that had evolved to actually be able to walk on land on all fours. All right, so life's history of descent with modification gives it an identity and continuity that separates it from the non-living world. Non-living world is not really changing. Minerals are minerals, water is water, and all of the things. But what we can see in the living world is that over time, as climate has changed, as things have diversified, or as things have evolved, that things get a lot more diverse and they change. All right, so we're going to go over the general properties of living systems. So one, we have chemical uniqueness. We have complexity and hierarchical organization. That is one of my least favorite words. Reproduction, possession of a genetic program, metabolism, development, environmental interaction, and then movement. So we're going to look at each one of these characteristics individually. Let's look at chemical uniqueness first. So living systems demonstrate a unique and complex molecular organization. We have cells. Each cell has a job, and our bodies are weirdly, amazingly organized to keep us alive. Small molecules are assembled into macromolecules. Those are nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and then lipids. And although living systems are composed of the same kinds of atoms, obeying the same fundamental laws of chemistry as non-living matter, the way that they're organized is what makes them unique. So what this is basically saying is the atoms that make up us, our cells, our bodies, and everything, it's the same exact atoms that are making up the non-living things around us. The hydrogen and oxygen that make up our bodies are the same hydrogen and oxygen that are in water, but water's not a living thing. So it's the structure of these macromolecules that make them special in living things. So here is protein. Protein is really specific. They look really, really crazy. This was also an example of what a protein can look like, just a different kind of graphic. But because of how they are organized, it is really the basis for the functions in the human body. All right, another thing is complexity. So living systems demonstrate a unique and complex hierarchical organization. In living systems, there exists a hierarchy of levels that includes macromolecules. So that was our proteins, nucleic acids, and all of that. Those create cells. Cells make up organisms. Organisms then make up populations, and populations make up species. So this is hierarchical level of organization, going from small to big. So in this picture, this is Volvox globator. It's a multicellular flagellate that illustrates 3 different levels of biological hierarchy. So we can see the cells, we can see the full organism, and then we can see a population. So those are 3 levels that we see. Another is living things have to be able to reproduce, otherwise how are more living things going to come? So reproduction is a component of the definition of life. At each level of the biological hierarchy, living forms reproduce to generate others like themselves. So genes have to replicate to produce new genes, as when cells make new cells, each cell is going to need its own set of genes, so those genes replicate. Cells then divide, producing new cells. Organisms also reproduce, that could be sexually or asexually, to produce new organisms. And then populations fragment to produce new populations. So each one of these steps is a form of reproduction. Reproduction doesn't just mean one organism reproducing to create another. And then those species can split to produce new species. Every species came from another species. When I talk about genetic program, we're talking about genes for inheritance, and those come from nucleic acids. Hopefully this is a little bit of a reminder from biology, but nucleic acids, they encode the structures of protein molecules needed for organismal development and functioning. They basically have the instructions of, okay, here's the protein that needs to be made for this, here's the protein that needs to be made for this, and that's how we function and live. DNA are long linear chains of nucleotides, and they store genetic information. And then genetic code is the correspondence between base sequences in DNA and then the sequence of amino acids in a protein. And then this just is showing the discovery and the structure of DNA. Next thing is metabolism. So living organisms maintain themselves by acquiring nutrients from their environments. The metabolic process includes digestion, energy production, which is respiration, and then also synthesis of molecules and structures required by organisms. So that could be your body making new cells. That could be plants producing sugars, but focusing on the animal side, us making new cells. Metabolism is an interaction of the destructive or catabolic and constructive anabolic reactions. And the most fundamental anabolic and catabolic chemical processes used by living systems arose early in evolutionary history of life. So there's different kinds of feeding processes. So this is an amoeba. An amoeba, it just kind of like, it's a blob that just like kind of brings the food in. So we see this like arm wrapping around to eat the thing. And then we have a chameleon, which is eating the way that, we think of eating, catching that bug. All right, the next is development. So all organisms pass through a characteristic life cycle. And development describes the characteristic changes that an organism undergoes from its original form to its final adult form, its original form being like young. So here is for a monarch butterfly. We have little caterpillars, and then it goes into metamorphosis to turn into a beautiful butterfly. All right, living things have to have interactions. Every single animal interacts with their environment in one way or another. And ecology is the study of those interactions with the environment. Ecology studies both animals and plants and the things that they interact with. All organisms respond to environmental stimuli, a property called irritability. So if it's too hot, your body is irritated, you will move somewhere else. For example, lizards are cold-blooded. They need help regulating their body temperature. So when it's early morning, maybe they are cold, so they're going to come out for the sun. In the midday, it's really hot, sun's right on top of them, so they're going to move under a rock, and then late afternoon, they're going to come back out because it's cooling down. Another is movement. So living systems in their parts show precise and controlled movements arising from within the system. So we can think of, moving, like actually moving around, walking, just moving bodies. But there's more to it than that. Living systems extract energy from the environment, permitting the initiation of controlled movements. We eat food, we can move. Movements at the cellular level, so where we don't see, but it is happening constantly, are required for reproduction, growth, responses to stimuli, and then also the development of multicellular organisms. So our cells in our body have to move for all of these things to happen. And on a larger scale, we can think of entire populations or species moving from one location to another. What makes this different from non-living matter? In non-living matter, it's not precisely controlled, and it requires external forces. All right, last little tidbit I'm going to plug in here is that life obeys the physical laws. Hopefully, if you've taken biology or chemistry, you have heard of the physical laws, but the first law of thermodynamics is the law of conservation of energy, and this states that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but can be transformed from one form to another. When you eat food and you are getting energy from that food, you are then using that energy in another form of like moving and then releasing that energy as heat. But that energy doesn't just poof disappear. All aspects of life require energy and its transformation. The second law is that physical systems tend to proceed toward a state of greater disorder or entropy. The ultimate fate of materials and cells is degradation and dissipation of their chemical bond energy as heat. So basically, things, even the organized cells that we have, eventually are going to break down and get to disorder. Organismal complexity is achieved and maintained only by the perpetual use and dissipation of energy flowing into the biosphere from the sun. So us being able to get energy from our food, use it to move, and then releasing that as heat, that is a really concentrated and solid form of energy. And then when we release it as heat, that's more of a disordered energy because we can't really use that for much. So life has to obey those physical laws. The complex molecular organization in living cells is attained and maintained only as long as energy fuels the organization. Survival, growth, and reproduction of animals requires energy that comes from breaking complex food molecules into simple organic waste. All right, this is just the beginning. But if you have any questions, I know that was a really long one. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you in the next one.